In 1954, the original Godzilla movie was released into theaters, and a movie monster legend was born. That first film being a story that cautioned against unchecked scientific progress with an anti-nuclear message on the hubris of man. It featured a giant radioactive dinosaur that destroyed Japan and had to be killed in order for the problem to be solved. But after that, the Godzilla sequels started to roll out, and it didn't take too long for the monster to turn into a joke by the end of that continuity. Once the Godzilla movies moved away from being about a monstrous threat to the world and instead turning him into an ally of mankind that would go up against other monsters and even over-the-top aliens, the brand it became super silly. And Godzilla himself was dumbed down to an incredibly ridiculous and immature level. Of course, with this change in direction, it was only a matter of time that the company would see a decline in the box office. And sure enough, after 1975's dismal ticket sales for Terror of Mechagodzilla, everyone thought it was about time to put the franchise on ice. In order to make people interested in Godzilla again, they had to do something different. Well, it took them nearly 10 years, but eventually, Godzilla, or The Return of Godzilla as it's also known, is a 1984 film directed by Koji Hoshimoto. The movie ignores every Godzilla film made after the 1954 original and serves as the official number 2 in this new timeline, making it not only one of the first direct sequels made to a popular franchise, but also one of the first reboots too. Think of it as an older equivalent to something like Halloween from 2018. I only compare it to that movie because, much like it, the 1984 film was going out of its way to reinvigorate the franchise and bring audiences back into theaters no matter what. You see, the idea was to basically ignore all of that super friendly, heroic presentation of the monster that these movies had become known for over the last couple decades and take the series back to its dark, nuclear-themed roots. The result was what kicked off the second continuity for the Godzilla series, and a movie that made Godzilla scary again. Now, a claim like that has to be followed up with me telling you guys that if you're expecting this thing to be one of the greatest horror movies ever made or anything like that, well, you're really only doing yourself a disservice because after all, it's still just a Godzilla movie, which means you can expect a guy in a big rubber suit destroying miniature buildings alongside lower grade effects and storytelling compared to what you'd see in the United States. But make no mistake, this is most definitely the movie that brought the monster back to his roots and the first one since that original that actually focused on why nuclear war and cataclysmic destruction is extremely unnerving. In fact, this movie opens up with a scene that builds up into something like what you'd find in a typical horror movie from the 70s or 80s, with an additional creature getting introduced, albeit only briefly, with a scientific explanation that further hammers home the whole radiation bad narrative. The Return of Godzilla begins 30 years after the events of the 1954 original. With a random act of nature, a volcanic eruption starts to wreak havoc to a ship that's passing by. Before things go seriously bad, the sailors glimpse a gigantic creature rising up from the island before we jump ahead to someone scoping out the derelict ship. What follows is a tone this movie goes for that might surprise you. With mutilated bodies being strung about the vessel, all drained of their blood, we stumble upon one lone survivor, as well as get an introduction to a really goofy-looking creature that has been killing off the guys in the ship. It's later revealed that this animal is a lowly sea louse, but it's one that has grown to this enormous size and taken on eerie powers due to it feeding on radioactive blood. Blood that might just be from a certain gigantic dinosaur we saw earlier. From there, the movie basically turns into an interesting monster movie version of a political thriller, with the Japanese understanding that this is the return of a Godzilla, the same type of creature that ravaged their country in the 50s. Only this time, the added complications of the Cold War are mixed in with Soviet Russia getting angry at the destruction of one of their subs at the claws of Godzilla. This leads into an admittedly badly acted meeting between three countries. Russia fears that Godzilla could attack them now that it's already destroyed a submarine, and America gets involved naturally as well. Ironically, Russia and the United States agree that the best method going forward is to nuke Godzilla, but Japan understandably doesn't like that idea at all, and I gotta admit, there's a lot of good stuff going on here. その時あなた方は首都ワシントンやモスクワでためらわずに核兵器を使える勇気がありますかと。 This is the kind of thing that I think really makes The Return of Godzilla shine, because it was the first time in years that one of these movies was actually taking that subject matter seriously, and it really does build the threat of the monster being equally as dangerous as mutually assured destruction from nuclear weapons. With both the United States and Soviet Russia on high alert, Godzilla isn't the only thing that Japan has to worry about in this film, because the prospect of sending in a warhead aimed directly at their territory is a constant worry discussed throughout the story. But hey, that doesn't mean that Godzilla himself doesn't get some time to be a villain again either, because this movie goes out of its way to make him really tear things up at a level we hadn't seen in years. The monster's redesign is also notable, with the company choosing to go for more of a mean look instead of that goofy frog-like design he'd been known to have in the 1970s. This time he's got bigger fangs, roars menacingly a lot, and even gets taller to up the stakes. My only complaint is the fact that I've always thought his eyes look really derpy, but hey, that's neither here nor there. It's a Godzilla movie. Some of that stuff is, you just gotta expect it. It was really cool to learn that they brought the creature to life by using a small animatronic though, instead of just going for a complete guy in a suit, which, yeah, I thought was kind of fun. Now, one other thing that this movie has going for it happens to be the way they present Godzilla to the audience, which is not just a movie monster anymore, but actually a full-fledged animal. Again, the first time he'd been like this since the 1950s, with only Godzilla Raids Again really exploring that animalistic side to him outside of the first movie. As such, you may find it interesting to know that nearly 10 years before Jurassic Park, The Return of Godzilla has the distinct reality as being one of the first giant box office properties to actually factor in dinosaurs being related to birds, which is an important part of this movie's plot. After it's found out that Godzilla may be following migratory flocks and behavior seen after he absorbs all the radiation from a nuclear power plant — that's a crazy sentence to say — the scientists use this information with a means to turn it against Godzilla by luring him into a volcano with bird frequencies so that they could blow it up and trap him inside. The Japanese military has other ideas though, like deploying the fan-favorite Super X ship, a specially designed craft that fires cadmium missiles inside of the monster's mouth in order to shut him down. Unfortunately, during an attack, a Russian official is unsuccessful in stopping the deployment of a nuclear warhead from space, which results in the ultimate problem faced in the film being not only Godzilla, but a live nuke headed straight for Japan, with the United States scrambling to shoot it down before it hits the country. This is really fun shit. 核弾頭は無理に命中します。つまり新宿で核爆発だ。30分後。Now, I've always thought this movie to be one of the best Godzilla films ever made, and while I'm totally aware of the series' reputation and know that this isn't saying much, there is something to be said about the sequel going back to the franchise's roots and trying to craft a truly thrilling Godzilla film centered around the horrors of nuclear war. Sure, it's cheesy in some spots, just like any of these other films, but the threat of destruction is constantly playing in the background of this old B-movie, and I personally really appreciated them making Godzilla more of a scientific disaster than just an impervious movie monster. You know, when you go back to old Hollywood or even old Japanese filmmaking, we've lost so much of that interesting, meaningful sensibilities and what made these things great. Like what made Star Wars great, Jurassic Park, Terminator, Godzilla. It really was the message of anti-nuclear war, and yeah, I appreciate this movie for going back to those roots. There's a specific scene involving a few characters making their way out of a skyscraper, by the way, that I think goes a long way too, since it isn't a nuke or Godzilla that you're worried about killing them, but simply the sheer fact that they're trying to escape via helicopter under some really bad turbulence. It's scenes like this that really set the movie apart from much of the other sequels that make up this brand. Oh, and another scene involving the military's attempt to return fire at Godzilla is met with a really crazy response that's pretty memorable. When the film came out in Japan, it was a pretty big success, with the movie selling around 3.2 million tickets in comparison to Terror of Mechagodzilla's measly gross of 980,000. Wow, that sucks. Unfortunately, it was re-edited and cut into a sillier version by an American film studio a year later for the expertly named Godzilla 1985. Boy, they sure spent a long time perfecting that one. If you're interested in checking this movie out, I'd recommend watching the original Japanese cut first, since you're more than likely going to already be jaded by the film's outdated and cheesy special effects, as well as its inability to match modern American movies at the time, like The Terminator. But make no mistake, this is definitely an important movie in this character's history, and personally, I'd go as far to say that it may be one of the most underrated Godzilla films ever made. People like it, but I don't think they give it enough credit for how good it really is, especially compared to a lot of those other ones. Definitely making my top 5, and even being a favorite that I think more people just need to see. What the Return of Godzilla does so excellently is bring the monster back to its original roots in a way that both respects the old school source material, while also opening up a new chapter in the franchise that goes off in a direction dedicated to those sensibilities. Man, one of the things that frustrated me the most about Jurassic World Dominion was the fact that everything going on in that modern Hollywood script seemed to jump into such a silly and outlandish direction that it mostly forgot about what made the original Jurassic Park great in the first place. The dinosaurs were no longer threatening, the hubris of man was downplayed, and instead of something simply cool, like dinosaurs attacking people on the mainland and Jeff Goldblum telling everyone he was right all the time, we get the progression of unchecked science getting solved by simply implementing more science, and our coexistence with them on the planet is something easily achieved. I don't know about you, but that don't sound like Jurassic Park to me, and in a similar way, the Godzilla franchise fell into that problem the longer those wild and over-the-top sequels got made in the 1960s and 70s. Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, Gigan, I like them to an extent, but they just gone so far away from that 1954 original they were unrecognizable. This movie did what was necessary in order to return that animal and the brand to its 1950s roots. And maybe someday, hopefully, we can see the same happen with a sequel to Jurassic Park. But hey guys, those are all just my own thoughts on the subject matter. What do you guys think about the Return of Godzilla? Have you seen it? And if so, what are your thoughts? I know I talked a little bit about that new Dominion movie, but I'm a fan and upset. So hey, whatever your own thoughts and opinions happen to be on this film, I'd love to hear them in the comments down below.